Okay, so this talk is based on the first chapter of this book, which is called Change of Heart. It's a really interesting book I bought a couple of years ago, which is all about what psychology can teach us about spreading social change. So this is basically the first chapter of this book, condensed into a presentation. So I'm not going to take any credit for anything which I'm about to present. But I really recommend reading this book, it's really useful. So, because the theme of the presentation is looking at systems change, I thought that one thing that's really interesting to look at is how we actually, if we want to change systems, we need to understand ourselves, and we need to understand why we're doing the things that we're doing and what some of the motivations are around that. So I quite like this one. It sort of sums up the idea of that, you know, it's not about the sticking plaster, it's about actually properly changing what's happening. So in order to understand ourselves, there's several things that he points out in the book that we need to consider, and that's what our identity means and how our identity links to social change, and what the psychology is behind that. Also stuff around emotional self-control and how actually our identity can be quite problematic in relation to our activism. Looking at also what it is that motivates us to do the things that we do, what motivates us to pick the causes that we do, and then at the end it's sort of looking a bit about how we get the most impact and what we need to consider in terms of the social change that we're trying to get to happen, and how we can measure what actual impact we're having. So yeah, I quite like this one, the age and activism. If anyone's ever seen this, I might actually go through it. So 0 to 10, I'm a superhero. 10 to 20, I'm going to end acne for everyone. 20 to 30, I'm going to end injustice for everyone. I've definitely been there. 30 to 50, I am the oldest person trying to end injustice for everyone. 50 to 70 is those youngsters will end injustice. 70 to 90, no one knows how to end injustice but me. And 90, I'm a superhero. It's a long way off, 90, but I'm looking forward to that one. So the first bit to talk about is self-identity and activism. And I think it's really interesting because activism can be a very large part of a person's identity. In fact, it can actually be sometimes it can be someone's whole identity to a degree. And in lots of ways that's quite good, because it provides a strong motivation for action. You know, you're embedded in it, and it gives you, you know, that sort of emphasis to go out and do something. And very often, you know, our causes and our identity are really entwined. You know, so you know, I'm a road protester, or I'm an anarchist, or I'm this, or I'm that, and you know, that's how I define myself and situate myself in the world. The problem is with this at times is that actually, in reality, there's often a negative bias towards those forms of identity. And what he argues in the book is there's this thing called lookism, which is like where actually if you're trying to affect social change with certain groups of people and you're going into a room, how you look straight away is going to have an impact on how persuasive your message is. So at that stage, you're then actually fighting two battles at the same time, because not only are you having to persuade people about your cause, you're also having to get them to listen to you, and they look at you and they've got a whole set of assumptions going on there. And there's a thing about, it's actually quite difficult if you're really embedded within a form of identity and yourself. In order to give up that identity to be more effective in your activism can mean, you know, abandoning what he talks about as social signifiers of group identity, so feeling like, you know, I'm no longer part of this social group. And also, you know, it can mean actually disagreeing with aspects of stuff within the groups that you're in, and can cause there to be challenges within those groups, because if you're trying to do something a bit different, and people are like, that can cause tensions. But for me, I think if you're interested in social change and activism, I actually hate the term activism, but if you're interested in social change, I think it's, you do need to consider what is the important thing. Is it your identity and group belonging, or is it the cause you're fighting for and how effective you can be? I quite like this one as well. I don't know if you can see the group of people queuing up to buy the Destroy Capitalism t-shirt for $30. I think it's Banksy or a rip-off. It's hard to tell these days. So the second thing that he talks about is how our emotions actually also impact quite a lot on our activism. And the thing of like how if we're acting out our emotions through the activism that we're doing and the techniques that we're trying to use to affect social change, that can actually also be counterproductive to our cause, potentially. And in the book he's saying that there's all kinds of sort of things around our ego, our jealousies, insecurities about ourselves that can get played out through what we're doing in order to try and affect social change. So for example, criticising others to feel better about yourself. Hatred is something because of an experience. It means you lash out more. The person who proclaims to know more than anyone else. People who get involved in groups to find social acceptance. Activism is driven by personal problems like depression or alienation rather than compassion. And I can see myself in quite a few of those over my 25 years of doing stuff. And it's also, we actually a lot of the time don't realise we're probably being driven by those things. So he's talking about how that can actually have quite a negative consequence. And I definitely spent most of my 20s doing this. You want to win every argument for the rest of your life. I didn't give up the need to be right for quite a long time. I think, Calvin and Hobbes, always good. So he talks about like emotional self-control being really important when you're doing forms of activism. So another thing he talks about is that it's tempting to choose tactics of activism that we actually find personally satisfying rather than maybe effective. So we like to have a noisy protest because it reinforces ourselves, what we feel about things, and it gives us a way of venting our anger. We write letters to give our opinions. We snap at people who don't agree with us in order to feel more powerful. And also, it does this stuff in some ways. It's not all bad, but I think it's like about keeping a check on it. Why are we doing these things? What are we trying to achieve? And because actually you do want to feel slightly powerful, otherwise you feel hopeless. But also you don't want that to be the dominant thing. And then, it's thinking about what is the most effective thing that we can do to help those that we want to help. So I think this is the thing to me which is really key, is like when you're looking at the social change you want to achieve, you should be looking at it objectively and saying, okay, what is it that we actually are trying to do here, and is it about, are the things that we're doing now more about us feeling better about ourselves and giving us something that we need, but actually isn't that effective? I mean, if you can get both happening at the same time, obviously that's great. But a lot of the time, it's like, let's go for a march around Bristol, because obviously that works and has changed loads of things, but it never has. But the amount of times I still go for marches around Bristol, living in Bristol. But, it doesn't change, it doesn't actually change anything, really. But what's quite interesting about that process of thinking about that, is that it may mean that it begins to challenge our actual lifestyle, what we think, how we do things, and it might mean that we might be having to do things instead which we wouldn't have necessarily felt comfortable with doing when we're in that sort of group. So for example, engaging with corporations in a different way rather than standing outside the front of their head office criticising them. There's all kinds of things you can think about, which actually, where is it getting in the way of us actually achieving the change that we want to see? And then secondly, the stuff about, thinking of stuff as a system rather than as a binary opposites, rather than us and them, sort of dynamic all the time, beginning to look at what's actually going on and what you want to achieve and how you can change that system to achieve some of the things that you want to achieve. Quite like this one. So emotional self-control. I would definitely push the button. So the other thing to look at is, and to consider is, how do you get involved in activism? What's the motivation for doing that? And he highlights two different ways that people tend to get involved in activism. The first one is one day you thought the world was unfair and wanted to change it. And actually, that's quite rare that people passionately take up activism. It's much more likely that it's because of personal or circumstantial reasons that people initially begin to get involved in stuff. And that's because usually it will be an issue that affects you or affects the people you're friends with or your family. It's something that you're interested in. It's something that your friends are actually involved in. And it could be something which you hear a lot about in the media, so you're like, okay, that's made me angry, I'm going to try and change that. So there's different reasons why people get involved. As you can see, lots of it can be based around identity. And dogs. So the other thing with that is that if you're looking at personal circumstantial reasons for getting involved in activism, we tend to prioritise issues that do have an element of self-interest, and people are more likely to embrace issues that are similar to them. And there's this thing called what he calls bias of concern, and that is where the things that we tend to gravitate towards are things that are related to caring about people who are like us, reflects cultural values. So like in this country we really like dogs, so loads of money goes towards charities for dogs, less so for livestock and these sorts of things. And the other thing he talks about is availability bias, and that's that people gravitate towards flashpoint issues, and that's issues that are in the media a lot, issues that affect the social group you're involved in. And there's a thing that goes on apparently where we tend to value more highly those things we hear the most about. So if you take the issue of fracking, for example, fracking's in the news, loads, groups are setting up, it's affecting local communities. It's quite an interesting, that's right, they rise into the surface as a major issue, which it should, quite rightly should, but it does show, is that, that's part of a much wider issue, fracking is, energy. People now anti-fracking, but haven't really been interested in the past so much maybe in developing massive renewable energy infrastructure and that sort of thing. Also, confrontational issues people tend to like a lot more because it gives you an enemy and someone to focus on, and they're much more likely to be covered by the media. So it's always bad news that you hear about, or stuff which is you don't hear about quiet peaceful protests particularly. So it gets a lot more coverage, and this can mean actually that by focusing on these things, more serious problems that actually you could have significant change are sort of ignored. And the other thing is by basing on the personal circumstantial factors, people then make a decision based on the perceptual bias, which is what is come out from the previous slide. The idea that these are the things which are really important. It's popular amongst your group and it involves other people, so you get involved in that. But what he says is that authentic compassion is a desire to do as much as we can to create a world with less suffering and destruction and more joy. And we should be really objectively thinking about how we can do that. So when you look at going back to identity or effectiveness, if your identity is tied to your activism, then you tend to value it a lot more highly because it's embedded in you in a way. You know, it's a real part of your life. So because of that, the more we believe we are right, and because of that, it can make it a lot more difficult to recognise that actually maybe we're not being that effective, or maybe that the things we do aren't the right things to be doing. And then if people begin to criticise what you're doing, saying actually what you're doing is not really achieving much, that then becomes a criticism of us, because our identity is embedded within us. It's like, you know, it makes it very difficult to split those things off. And then you can get what's called cognitive dissonance, which is where you get a disjunction between your beliefs and your behaviours. And because we crave the consistency between the two, it's very difficult to sometimes make a shift to doing something different. And it means that, you know, we can act irrationally around things, that we cling to methods, like I was saying, like the, you know, let's go and do another protest, let's go and do this, but effectively it's not really changing anything. And there are, I'm sure, like people know, like, or have been involved in, you know, where you're doing the same thing over and over again as part of your campaign. It's like that definition of insanity, you know, you do the same thing over and over again, thinking that something different's going to happen. So the second thing he talks about is how activism operates. So most activism is reactionary, so you're reacting against something, and that's largely motivated by our emotional reactions to situations. So we see something bad happen, you know, we're like, that's bad, I feel angry, I want to do something about it, so I react to it. And actually, you know, that has benefits, because obviously it shows social disapproval, you know, and it can highlight issues and that sort of thing. But very often it doesn't usually change that problem. It's not addressing the systemic issues which cause that. So because of that, we also instinctively lash out at the most visible symbols of what we oppose. But you have to ask the question, is this actually effective? So yeah, quite like this one. Most positive thing I've done all year. So proactive campaigning can be a lot better actually, because it means you're objective. You're calmly examining a situation. You're looking at actually what is the root cause of the problem. You then can figure out what will have the most impact. You can then plan accordingly. And then, I mean, the thing is that it takes more effort and thought and involves emotional self-control. But what it does is it means that you're probably potentially going to be more effective. And that might be that you come to the conclusion that having a protest around Bristol is the best thing to do. But rather than going at it from the point of view of like the emotional reaction which is tied to your identity and what you've done before, you've actually thought about it in a systematic way. And there's a thing in systems thinking about leverage points. You know, you try and look where is the most effective place to focus effort in order to get a change to happen. And also, it also means that you think critically about what you're doing rather than just going with something. You begin to go, right, what if we do this? What if we do that? I actually think a lot of activism can actually accentuate the problem you're trying to achieve at times. You know, so if you're protesting against certain things, it can give the people you're protesting against more power and grist to the mill, because they can begin to use the state and police to actually enforce what they're doing. So I think there's a real interesting dynamic, and there's a thing I think about very often. We feel that as a group we're outside of a system, rather than seeing that actually we're part of the interaction of it. So when we see ourselves as separate from it, we feel like we're inputting into it, but we're not part of it. And I think it's only when you begin to really think about, actually, we play a part in this. You know, there's a role that we're playing in this dynamic, and what does that mean, and what outcomes do you get out of that? So yeah, quite this one now. You know, let them protest, they will always be unimportant. So I think about Occupy. So what's better to do then in terms of like looking at that perspective? So he argues that because we have often limited time and energy on getting the most impact, that it's better to look at a utilitarian sort of perspective. Is that rather than looking at the motives about, you know, what do we do, what does activism do in terms of making us feel good about ourselves, helping ourselves and those close to us, or acting out our self-identity, we should carefully think more about what is it that we can do which is the most effective thing to achieve what we want to achieve. And that can actually mean moving into quite uncomfortable areas of advocacy. And this is like a really good slope about, you know, what systems thinking and thinking critically. Some of the things that you do, you know, like seeing the world through the eyes of others, asking where I am in this, you know, open to different ways of knowing, experimenting with different techniques to see what works. I mean, that's a big thing that I don't think happens enough in sort of social changes. You know, why don't you take 5 things, try each one, and see what happens, rather than keep doing the same ones. So one of the things to do is to have a plan on how you're going to maximise the impact. You making your choices based on reduced suffering, increasing happiness, and working, you know, doing stuff that can impact on the most people as possible. Because lots of campaigns actually focus on major issues but have no impact. So it's better to look at what can you actually change, how can you do that, what power does your group actually have, how can it intervene in the system to get that change to happen. And, you know, looking at how, like, so there's 2 things that can happen when change happens. Well, there's more to it, but these are 2. Like, you know, if you get a behaviour change, that leads to a concrete thing happening, and if you get a policy change, that leads to a concrete thing actually being achieved. And the last thing is like sort of to record and analyse the impact of what you're doing. So, you know, like I say again, like if you're experimenting with things, you know, you're only going to know if it's been effective if you've actually looked at it and gone, right, well, what did we actually achieve? What went right there? What went wrong? What could we do differently? And he talks about, you know, creating the idea of creating a bottom line from where you start, measuring the concrete quantitative things. He does argue that qualitative measures, you know, asking people what they thought, actually isn't that a great way of measuring stuff, because actually people will say, you know, I'm green but then I fly 3 times a year. You know, so it's like attitude and actual behaviour change, quite different things. And the other thing is like starting with specific goals and end with measurable results, so you can actually see, you know, you can see what's going on. And the other thing is you also need to consider what would have happened if you did nothing. And, you know, the other thing he says is like look for low-hanging fruits, you know, things which could have a big impact in a quick way and bring significant changes. And this is George, who is changing the system from the inside. I just want to finish by reading a short story out of this book called Some, and it's Tales from the Afterlife. I really recommend this. It's a really good little book. Good one for the toilet. So there's this story called Some, and I'll just read it out. It says, in the afterlife, you relive all your experiences, but this time with the events reshuffled into a new order. All the moments that share a quality of group together. You spend 2 months driving the street in front of your house, 7 months having sex. You sleep for 30 years without opening your eyes. For 5 months straight, you flip through magazines while sitting on a toilet. You take all your pain at once, all 27 intense hours of it. Bones break, cars crash, skin is cut, babies are born. Once you make it through, it's agony-free for the rest of your afterlife. But that doesn't mean it's always pleasant. You spend 6 days clipping your nails, 15 months looking for lost items, 18 months waiting in line, 2 years of boredom, staring at a bus window, sitting in an airport terminal, 1 year reading books, your eyes hurt and you itch because you can't take a shower until it's time to take your marathon 200-day shower, 2 weeks wondering what happens when you die, 1 minute realising your body has fallen, 77 hours of confusion, 1 hour realising you've forgotten someone's name. That's more than that, yeah. I was going to say. Yeah. That's optimistic. 3 weeks realising you're wrong, 2 days lying, 6 weeks waiting for a green light, 7 hours vomiting, 14 minutes experiencing pure joy, 3 months doing laundry, 15 hours writing your signature, 2 days tying shoelaces, 67 days of heartbreak, 5 weeks driving lost, 3 days calculating restaurant tips, 51 days deciding what to wear, 9 days pretending you know what is being talked about, 2 weeks counting money, 18 days staring into the refrigerator, 34 days longing, 6 months watching commercials, 4 weeks sitting in thought, wondering if there was something better you could be doing with your time, 3 years swallowing food, 5 days working buttons and zippers, 4 minutes wondering what your life would be like if you reshuffled the order of events. In this part of the afterlife, you imagine something analogous to your earthly life, and the thought is blissful. A life where episodes are split into tiny swallowable pieces, where moments do not endure, where one experiences the joy of jumping from one event to the next, like a child hopping from spot to spot on the burning sand. And the reason I read that is I think it's quite interesting to think of that in relation to what you do around social change. So I'd probably say I've spent probably 3 months arguing with people who weren't listening to me. Quite a month walking around. I don't know, there's loads, I could probably go on. But I think, yeah, when you begin to think of it in that respect, you know, time is important and what you do is important, and how you can be effective is.
Mike, can I just say, if the author of that book thinks you only spent 67 days with heartbreak,
I know.
he or she must be 15 years old.
Yeah.